The first 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator struck the roof of the IRGC Central Command bunker at roughly 720 miles per hour. It tore through 30 feet of reinforced concrete with astonishing force. 3 seconds later, a second GBU-57 followed the same entry point and went off deep inside the underground foundation. The shockwave overwhelmed the entire complex before a single warning could be heard. High above the clouds, the B-21 Raider turned away in silence, with a radar signature no larger than a golf ball. In that moment, it had broken apart Tehran's supposedly untouchable defenses without showing up on a single Iranian radar screen. The Iranian air defense network, built around Russian technology, had been outmatched. As the B-21 Raider reduced Iran's command structure to ruins, the USS Abraham Lincoln and its strike group launched a fast approach toward the Strait of Hormuz. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyers pushed their A/S-PY-1D radars at full output, saturating Iranian coastal sensors with signals. The Fifth Fleet wanted to be noticed. They wanted the IRGC focused entirely on the surface force. Inside Iran's coastal bunkers, the reaction came instantly. Commanders saw a large American carrier strike group moving toward their territorial waters. They activated shore-based NOR anti-ship missile batteries and ordered fast attack craft to prepare for a swarm response. To Iran's leadership, this was the battle they had spent 40 years preparing for. They saw the massive profile of the USS Abraham Lincoln on their screens and believed they finally had a clear target. Blinded by the scale of the surface fleet's signal, the IRGC reached out to Moscow. They needed an unseen edge. They needed Russia to seal off the strait before the Fifth Fleet could move through the choke point. For those of you who served with the Fifth Fleet, you know the sound of general quarters in the middle of the night. You know the tension of watching Iranian fast boats race along the perimeter of our ships in the strait. If you served on a carrier, a destroyer, or a cruiser in those waters, share your ship's name and hull number in the comments. This community is built on the stories of the men and women who stood those watches, and we want to hear yours. Moscow responded quickly. Unable to risk a direct clash with the U.S. Navy, it chose a covert move instead. Two Project 6 36.3 Kilo-class submarines, known to NATO as the Black Hole because of their extreme acoustic stealth, slipped out of their Mediterranean port and passed through the Suez Canal under civilian cover. By the time the Fifth Fleet began its highly visible push, those Russian submarines were already positioned at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. On board were Russian technical advisors and a shipment of MDM-2 smart mines. These were nothing like the fixed naval mines of the last century. The MDM-2 was an autonomous weapons platform. Once placed on the seafloor, it could remain dormant, relying on highly sensitive acoustic and magnetic sensors. It was programmed to disregard civilian tankers and tugboats, waiting instead for the distinct acoustic signature of a U.S. Ticonderoga-class cruiser or the massive propellers of an American carrier. Russia's objective was to help Iran create a hidden minefield that could transform the narrow strait into a deadly bottleneck. If a U.S. carrier were disabled by an unexplained underwater blast, the blockade would grind to a halt. Moscow believed its Kilo-class submarines were effectively invisible to the Americans. They were operating beneath the thermal layer, where abrupt shifts in water temperature bend sonar waves and make anything below extremely difficult for surface ships to detect. The Russian crews felt secure because they were expecting 20th century threats. They were watching for P-8A Poseidon aircraft and hull-mounted sonar. What they were not watching for were the Remus 600 and the LBS-G2 Slocum glider. Weeks before the first move in the conflict, the U.S. Navy had already seeded the strait with dozens of these autonomous underwater vehicles. The Remus 600 is roughly the size of a person and travels at little more than a walking pace. It uses passive hydrophones to listen rather than announce its presence. In effect, these drones functioned like drifting underwater ears. The UUV swarm detected the unmistakable cavitation signature of the Russian Kilo-class propellers long before the submarines reached their mine-laying positions. That information was then sent in low probability of intercept satellite bursts to U.S. Fifth Fleet Command. The Americans did not engage. They did not even alter course. Instead, they let the operation continue and turned it into a trap. The U.S. Navy allowed the Russian crews to deploy their mines because the Remus 600 drones were recording the precise coordinates of every single device as it settled onto the seafloor. In other words, the U.S. allowed the enemy to build a minefield while quietly collecting the exact map needed to neutralize it. By staying silent, Washington ensured that the Russian submarines would remain in the area, convinced they were still undetected, while the Navy prepared a response that would leave the Russian fleet with only two options: pull back or risk full exposure. Back on the Iranian mainland, the IRGC was preparing what it believed would be its strongest shield: 4 batteries of the Russian S-400 Triumph air defense system had been moved to the coast. These systems are often promoted as stealth hunters. Their 9-2 N6E Gravestone radar is built to track targets out to 250 miles and direct missiles at speeds up to Mach 14. As the 5th Fleet decoy force moved into range, an Iranian operator picked up what appeared to be a target. On his screen, it looked like an FA-18 Hornet flying a steady, predictable pattern. The Iranian commander gave the launch order. 248 N6E-3 missiles surged from their mobile launchers, reaching nearly 3,800 miles per hour within seconds. The crews watched their screens, expecting a direct intercept. But the contact they were tracking was not a real aircraft. It was a false signature engineered by the B-21 Raider. The B-21's electronic warfare system had captured the S-400's radar pulses, analyzed them almost instantly, and sent back a carefully crafted deception signal. To the Russian-built radar, the sky seemed crowded with targets one moment, empty the next, and then suddenly showed an aircraft where none existed. This technique is known as digital radio frequency memory jamming. Confused by the shifting false returns, the Iranian missiles lost guidance. One detonated in empty air. The other fell into the Persian Gulf several miles away from any American ship. By the time the Iranian operators understood what was happening, it was already too late. Their $800 million air defense system was being manipulated by a 6th-generation bomber. They were launching at illusions while the real aircraft remained unseen, circling above them. As the coastal S-400 batteries stayed occupied with phantom targets and lit up the night with wasted launches, the B-21 Raider was already turning toward its main objective. Deep in the rugged ridgelines of the Zagros Mountains, north of Bandar Abbas, sat Site 14. Inside that mountain complex, Russian technicians were rushing to prepare a battery of 3 3M-22 Zircon hypersonic missiles. These were the weapons intended to slip past the Aegis defenses protecting the 5th Fleet. Inside the B-21, there was no panic and no confusion. The mission computer had already absorbed high-resolution underground imagery provided by a KH-11 reconnaissance satellite. The aim point was not the entire site, but a precise vent shaft and a known weak spot in the granite ceiling, about 60 feet below the surface. Then, the B-21's large internal weapons bay opened with a low mechanical hum, revealing 2 massive silver forms. These were GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, each weighing 30,000 pounds, the heaviest conventional bombs in the American inventory. The aircraft lifted slightly as that enormous weight dropped away. The 2 GBU-57s descended into the thin mountain air, their lattice fins deploying immediately. Guided by GPS and inertial navigation, they rotated nose down and entered a near-vertical terminal dive. Within seconds, they passed the speed of sound. Gravity and aerodynamics turned the 30-foot steel bodies into precision instruments built for one purpose. The first GBU-57 hit the mountain peak at close to 800 miles per hour. A deep metallic impact echoed through the ridgeline. Its hardened nose, strengthened with a tungsten nickel-iron alloy, drove through 60 feet of solid granite in less than a second. 3 seconds later, the second GBU-57 followed through the exact same opening. It punched through the fractured rock and detonated in the facility's fuel storage sector. The first blast sent extreme pressure through the tunnel network, turning the underground passageways into channels of fire and force. The second blast set off the liquid propellant stored for the Zircon hypersonic missiles. A towering column of white-hot flame and shattered rock burst from the mountaintop, rising nearly 300 feet into the air. Follow-on detonations continued for the next 10 minutes. The Zircon missiles that had been prepared for the USS Gerald R. Ford were now erupting inside their own launch tubes, ripping the mountain apart from within. Seismic monitors in Dubai and Kuwait even registered the strike as a localized earthquake. On the B-21 sensors, the target had gone from a hardened underground complex to nothing more than a debris field. The Raider crew sealed the weapons bay, banked sharply west, and disappeared again into radar silence. What had been presented as an untouchable fortress was taken apart by 2 bombs and an aircraft no one could track. The loss of the Zircon site immediately changed the situation in Moscow. Within minutes of the blast, the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations sent a direct red-line message to the Russian Ministry of Defense. The packet contained high-definition sonar recordings of the Kilo-class submarines laying mines. It also included overhead imagery showing Russian advisors caught in the mountain strike. The message was direct. The United States had proof of Russia's active combat role, and it had the exact location of the submarines. If those boats did not surface and clear the strait within 30 minutes, they would be treated as active threats and intercepted with Mk-48A DCAP torpedoes. At that point, Russian leadership understood that the shadow strategy had collapsed. Their supposedly unseen submarines were now exposed, and their covert involvement was fully known to U.S. intelligence. The Kilo-class crews were ordered to perform an emergency blow of their ballast tanks. With the mission compromised and some of their most advanced assets already lost, the Russian force turned back. They pulled away from the Iranian fast boats they were supposed to support and left the IRGC to face the full pressure of the U.S. Navy alone. With the Russian submarines withdrawing and the coastal air defenses effectively neutralized, the USS Gerald R. Ford moved into the engagement zone. On the Iranian side, the IRGC, feeling abandoned by Moscow, launched one final desperate move. They sent 60 fast attack craft and Bogomar speedboats into the strait. Small, fast, and armed with C-802 anti-ship missiles, these boats were designed to rush in from every direction at once and overload a destroyer's Aegis combat system. But the USS Gerald R. Ford never gave them the chance to close the distance. Instead, it launched a squadron of F-35C Lightning II fighters. Using their AN/APG-81 radars and EOTS targeting systems, the F-35Cs identified every boat in the swarm from 50 miles away. The jets did not move in with cannons or short-range weapons. Instead, they released AGM-158 CLRASM missiles. Once in the air, the missiles coordinated with each other, using onboard AI to sort through the swarm, determine which boats carried the greatest threat, and separate real targets from decoys. Flying just 30 feet above the waves at high subsonic speed, the LRASMs stayed at sea-skimming altitude. Their low observable profile kept them off the Iranian crew's radar, and the attack arrived before anyone on those boats fully understood what was happening. One after another, IRGC vessels disappeared from the fight. There was no close-range duel and no drawn-out exchange. It was a fast, highly automated operation. Inside their cockpits, the F-35C pilots watched as the digital markers for Iranian boats blinked off their displays. Of the 60 craft that launched, only 4 were still operational after the first 10 minutes. Those last 4 turned back toward the Iranian coast, only to be intercepted by MH-60R Seahawk helicopters carrying Hellfire missiles. The swarm had been broken apart before it ever came within sight of a U.S. warship. The entire operation lasted less than 6 hours. In that short span, the U.S. Navy demonstrated that the old model of warfare no longer sets the pace. Iran's leadership had built its strategy around Russian legacy systems, the S-400, the Kilo-class submarine, and the sheer volume of a swarm assault. They believed numbers combined with battle-tested Russian hardware would be enough to challenge the Fifth Fleet. They were mistaken. The U.S. Navy's shift toward next-generation systems has created more than a simple advantage. It has opened a gap so wide that it changes the entire battlefield. The B-21 Raider controls the electromagnetic environment. The F-35C does more than fly missions. It helps shape the fight as a networked command platform in the sky. When submarines designed for stealth can be tracked by drones no larger than a person, and fortified underground sites can still be reached by 30,000-pound penetrators, the idea of a safe sanctuary starts to disappear. The message for anyone thinking of taking on the U.S. Navy is clear. Outdated systems are no match for next-generation warfare. In the modern battlespace, by the time you realize you have been targeted, the outcome may already be decided. Disclaimer: we value accuracy, and this video uses dramatized storytelling to give viewers a vivid sense of how such an operation could unfold. At the same time, some parts of this video present a hypothetical scenario and should not be treated as a factual report of real events. Any dialogue, reactions, or emotional elements are fictional and are based on publicly available information about military capabilities and geopolitical tensions. Thank you.